Awesome. Well, thank you so much again for joining us in our next business boot camp this morning. Following our business boot camp, we will have our new member orientation, which will start at 11. So today's presentation will be presented by our very special friend, Gabriel Sam Groves. She will talk about getting on contract, how the federal government outsources its requirements. So before that, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We'll be answering questions towards the ending of the presentation. So we encourage you all to share any questions that way, or if you want to unmute yourself at the end, we'll welcome some time for that. But for time purposes, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining us today and presenting today's very special presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. So we're going to go through this really quickly because there's quite a bit of information. And I want to thank the Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce for having me. And the Minority Business Development Agency Phoenix Center. And they will have these slides available on their website after this session. So as we're going to go through this rather rapidly, you're going to want to take a look at these slides afterwards. Like I said, there's a lot of information that we're going to try to cover here in a very short time. The first slide is the overview. And we're going to be covering acquisition thresholds for the federal government, the government's acquisition process, various acquisition strategies that the government uses. We'll cover types of solicitations, the standard forms that are used for solicitations. We're going to cover the uniform contract format, which the federal government uses. And then really briefly, we're going to go through the sections of a typical request for proposal. And then after that, hopefully we might have time for questions and answers. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the acquisition thresholds that the federal government uses, the first threshold is what we refer to as the micro purchase threshold. For a long time, it was at $3,500. Now it's recently been raised to $10,000. And at this level, supplies are purchased often with the GPC card, the government purchase card, which is a credit card, or small purchase orders. No competition is really required at this level. If the contracting officer gets quotes and determines that the price is reasonable, they can go ahead and award a small contract to an offeror. And it does not require that purchase go to a small business at this level. Now, the next level we refer to as the Simplified Acquisition Threshold level, or the SAT, and that's between $10,000 and $250,000. Now, when it gets up to $15,000, that's when the federal government is required to put out a public notice, either through Facebook or through the website. When we get up to $250,000, that's when it's definitely mandated for the small business program, and we are required to utilize more formalized source selection processes. Next slide, please. Now, a really fast outline in general of the government's acquisition process is that the requirements are identified. For construction, the requirements for infrastructure, for remodeling or renovations, upgrades to facilities, the requirements are identified by your civil engineering organization. At the large program level, you have your program office that's going to identify the requirements for the federal government. They capture that information in documentation, and then they send it over to the contracting agency. The contracting agency Looking at the identification of the requirements, they start their market research process. And that's done through attending trade shows, meeting with contractors one-on-one, issuing sources sought through beta.sam.gov. And sources sought is a formalized synopsis of what the upcoming requirement will be. And it asks offerers who consider themselves qualified to provide a response back to the government. This is how the government finds out what sources are available, who's out there that may be qualified, and who is absolutely interested in competing for the upcoming acquisition. And there's other means of market research, too, that the government does. The contracting folks will go out there on the SBA's dynamic search engine and search for offerers via NAICS codes or CAGE codes, looking for specific contractors. And like I said, they attend trade shows and conferences, gathering as much information as possible. After the market research is conducted, they take a look at it and analyze it, and then they determine what is the best acquisition strategy that they should utilize. That's when they decide if it's going to go like maybe a small business set-aside, for instance, or if there's not enough competition in the small business arena, they may decide to go full and open, unrestricted with their acquisition. But once the strategy has been determined, they will issue what they call a pre-solicitation notice that goes out on beta.sam.gov, a formalized pre-solicitation notice that gives the industry heads up that a solicitation is about to be issued. Then the solicitation is issued. Proposals are received when they're due. There's a formalized evaluation process that takes place, and then the successful offer is selected, and a contract is awarded to that successful offeror. Next slide, please. Now, the acquisition strategies themselves that the contracting folks will look at is driven by the dollar value of the acquisition, the project complexity, small business goals that need to be met. Like, for instance, if they are a little bit low in meeting the goals for hub zone, they may decide that the acquisition should go as a hub zone set aside, for instance. And time constraints can also drive what strategy you use. For the really formalized source selections for the high dollar contracts, source selections can take several months up to maybe a year. At the systems level, which is the major weapon systems, we're talking about multi-billion-dollar contracts, a source selection could take up to 2 years. Everything is driven by the dollar. And the various acquisition strategies include, but are not limited to, sealed bidding. Sealed bidding usually is used for construction projects, standalone construction projects that are well-defined, has a statement of work, drawings, specifications, everything is pretty much set, no ambiguity in the project, and that's where we could go out with a sealed bid. And of course, when the sealed bids come in, they're looked at on price status only. That's all that's looked at, is the price. Lowest price technically acceptable is where the proposals will come in, and the contracting office determines, they look at all the proposals, and they look at those that are technically acceptable based on criteria that is pre-established. And then they rank the proposals that have been determined to be technically acceptable by price, looking at the lowest price first. And that's how they'll award. Performance price trade-off is when evaluations take place on the proposals, and the government is willing to pay a little bit more. They won't go simply with the lowest price. They're willing to pay a little bit more for more confidence in the offerer's ability to successfully complete the requirement. They always look at technically acceptable first, and then they look at the prices, and then finally in that evaluation process, they'll look at whether or not there's more confidence in the past performance of that offerer that gives them more confidence in the offerer's ability to be successful. You'll pay a little bit more to get that contractor on contract. And of course, best value is always looked at as the best value to the federal government, the government's best interests. Everything is evaluated, and then that's what they go with. What is the best successful completion of the contract? Okay, now we're going to go into types of solicitations. That is the next slide, please. A solicitation is a request to basically submit offers and quotations to the government. The government is soliciting for your quote or your proposal. And the government announces its requirements to the industry via solicitations. And there are a number of different types of solicitations. For instance, for the smaller dollar type of acquisitions, for instance, those that fall within the micro threshold range, we go for what we call the request for quotations, RFQs. Now, in a previous session, we talked about the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, which is the Bible for contracting in the federal sector. And we talked about the chapters of the FAR being referred to as parts. Each part of the FAR covers a different aspect of contracting. For requests for quotations, solicitations are addressed under FAR Part 13 for the Simplified Acquisition Procedures for RFQs. Often commercial buys are done via the policies and the procedures outlined in FAR Part 13. Now, invitation for bids, that's covered under FAR Part 14, where it covers sealed bidding procedures. And then the more formalized requests for proposals are done under the auspices of FAR Part 15, which covers the solicitations, what's included in solicitations, how negotiations are conducted. It talks about during formal source selection, how the government can communicate with the offerors. That's all under FAR Part 15. And again, that's under the more formalized source selection procedures. Okay? And we're going, like I said, I'm going through this really, really fast. I invite you all to go in to the FAR website online and take a look at these various parts so that you can really familiarize yourselves with the various parts. Those parts of the FAR that address the type of service or product that your company provides. Now, the government, the federal government, is very, very regulated, very standardized. And there are special forms that the government uses for its solicitations. The next slide shows you the standard forms that are used for solicitations. For instance, SF, which stands for Standard Form 330 is used to acquire input or proposals from architectural or engineering firms, design firms. That's where they put in the information regarding their qualifications, and there's an evaluation process specifically for A&E acquisitions. The SF33 is used for invitation for bids. That's where you're going out for sealed bidding. The SF1442 is used for the solicitation and the award of construction contracts. SF 1449 are used for the solicitation and the awarding of service contracts. And the SF 30 is used for solicitation amendments or modifications to an awarded contract. And then the DD form 1155 is what's used for awarding delivery orders or task orders against an IDIQ type of contract. IDIQ being indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. Okay. Individual projects, for instance, on a construction IDIQ are awarded via task orders or delivery orders. Okay, now the next slide is the uniform contract format. As I mentioned, the federal government is very standardized and regulated in the way that they do things. I know that in the commercial world, each company pretty much figures out their own format for how they do their proposals and their contracts. But in the federal government, it's all pretty well standardized. We all use the same form. And it's referred to as the uniform contract format. Okay? And because it's regulated and is standardized, there's basic information that has to be provided in any kind of solicitation, whatever it may be. The solicitation will consist of sections A through M, which covers specific information. And again, that's all required and standardized by the FAR. Okay, next slide, please. Now, the uniform contract format consists of 4 parts. Part 1 is the schedule, which is sections A through H. Part 2 are your contract clauses in section I. Part 3 is a list of documents and attachments, exhibits, which is under section J of the solicitation and the awarded contract. And then part 4 are the representations and instructions. The reps and certs is what we refer to those. And that's sections K, and then of course through M. L and M is where the instructions are given to the offerers and what to include in their proposals. And section M outlines the criteria that the government uses in evaluating those proposals. Okay, now we're going to go into the various sections of the RFP. This is kind of an eye chart here, unfortunately. What I did was I included little snapshots of the various pages of a typical construction solicitation. These are like old contracts from when I was at Luke Air Force Base, just to give you an idea of what your solicitation could look like. A lot of the information is specific to the construction, acquisition, the service contract, which is done on SF 1449. There may be differing information, but in general, the sections will be the same. A lot of the clauses which dictate the terms and conditions of the contract will be the same. There are a lot of mandatory clauses that have to be in any contract, regardless of what it is that the government is purchasing. And as I mentioned, because it's all standardized, for instance, I worked for the Air Force, I did construction. However, because everything is pretty much standardized from agency to agency in the federal sector under the FAR, I could take a contract, for instance, from the FAA and still be able to find my way through it, navigate through their contracts, to figure out what their clauses are, to understand what it is that they're purchasing, what the requirements, terms and conditions are, and how they're dictating their requirements to any offeror that may be proposing on an FAA contract, because it's all standardized. And by the same token, somebody from, for instance, the Department of the Interior could easily take one of my Air Force contracts and take a look at it and find their way through whatever information they require, because it will be familiar to them because it's all under the FAR. The government loves standardization. So the next slide that you're going to be looking at shows you a snapshot of a 1442. This is Section A, the first page of your solicitation, and it would then become the first page of your contract later. And Section A, as I said, is the front page. And as you're looking through this page, this identifies the solicitation number for you. Up at the very top, you'll see the solicitation number. Tells you the date that it was issued, tells you the number of pages in this document. And it, as you go further down, Section 7, Block 7, gives you the identification of the actual agency that issued the solicitation. And then when you read further down, it'll give you basic information regarding the solicitation. You will see the date and the time frame at which your proposals are due. You have to be making sure that you get everything in on time, because those time frames are set in stone. They are mandatory. And because this is construction, it'll have information regarding bonding. Okay. And as you're looking at this front page too, it tells you the type of acquisition that's being conducted, whether it's a small business set aside, if it's full on open competition, etc. Okay. Next slide shows you the back of Section A. Okay, the back page of 1442. And that becomes part of your proposal. You're going to be filling that in, your information. You're going to be signing it as the offeror when you turn in your proposal. Next slide is a snapshot of Section B of the solicitation. And what you see are what we refer to as CLINs. Contract line item numbers, CLINs. Like, for instance, there's CLIN 1 and CLIN 2 on this particular snapshot. And it provides you a description of what the government is purchasing. And in the blank that you see there, that's where you're going to be inserting your pricing for that project or item. We'll be looking at the unit pricing, the quantities, the unit of issue, option years, if applicable. That's all included in Section B. And if there are option years, that's going to be applicable to this particular acquisition. Section B will include paragraphs and a schedule that lets you know when those options are going to be exercised. Okay. Now, to keep the number of slides down, I did not include a snapshot of what those would look like. But for those of you who hopefully have some experience in taking a look at a solicitation, you'll see in Section B that often there's quite a bit of information that's included in there to include option exercises, etc. Okay. Now, Section C, which is the next slide, that's the description and specifications. So for smaller documents, for instance, this is where we would actually attach statements of objectives, statements of work for construction, or a performance work statement in regarding service contracts. And then this is also where we would actually incorporate the wage determinations from the Department of Labor. Department of Labor provides Service Contract Act wage determinations for service contracts, and they are also the folks that provide us with the wage determinations for Davis-Bacon for construction. Construction projects $3,000 and up are required to use Davis-Bacon. Okay, and this is also where we would include the specifications and procedurals. Contractor data requirement lists, where there is a listing of documents or reports or proposed materials. All of that is listed in what we call the procedurals, and those are deliverables that the offerer will be providing back to the government post-award. That's going to be one of the requirements of the awarded contract, that the contractor is going to be required to provide like I said, material listings or reports, things like that, okay, under the seed rules. Now, for those documents that are very, very large in size, like, for instance, large statements of work, large specifications, drawings, and things like that, rather than actually being incorporated into the solicitation at Section C, instead it will be listed by reference in Section J, which we'll see in a little bit. Okay? Now, the next slide is Section D. And Section D talks about the packaging and marketing, or excuse me, marketing of certain supplies or items that have to be provided back to the government. Like, for instance, like maybe the government is purchasing some type of a monitor or piece of equipment, and it has to be packaged in a certain way, has to have special markings. And this is where Section D will address that. Now, in every section of the solicitation and then later the awarded contract, there are clauses within each section that address specifically that area. For instance, in Section D, there will be special clauses that will be in there specifically addressing packaging and marking. Okay. Now, the next slide is Section E. And this is where the government addresses inspections and acceptance of supplies and services. Normally, when equipment, for instance, is provided, inspection and acceptance is usually done at the destination. And for contracts that may involve some research, for instance, first article testing, because they're providing like a first-time configuration of some kind of equipment, for instance, first article testing is done. This is where it would be addressed, is in Section E. Now, going on to the next slide is Section F, where it talks about deliveries or periods of performance. Deliveries, of course, are those items, supplies that are being provided back to the government. Tells you what time, place, and method of delivery is expected. And there could be a specific date or a stated time frame for the delivery. On construction, of course, we're talking about periods of performance, and the period of performance can be specified, and it's usually specified via wording that says calendar days after issuance of a written notice to proceed. Notice to proceed is what the contracting officer gives the offeror after award of the contract, and normally after a pre-construction meeting has taken place where everybody, all the parties gather, they go through the documentation, everybody's on the same sheet of music, and then the contracting officer issues to the contractor a written notice to proceed that authorizes the contractor to begin ordering materials, for instance, starting to get their suppliers and their subcontractors on board by schedule. And like I said, in a construction contract in Section F, all of that is specified. Period of performance via calendar days, using a Julian calendar. We talk about after issuance of written notice to proceed. And that's usually negotiable too. You'll see it in the solicitation, what the government would like for a period of performance. And if you can do better and faster, you can put that in your proposal. It's negotiable. And again, the last item that you would notice in the Section F regarding deliveries of equipment or supplies, it'll tell you if they want it FOB by destination versus origin. Okay? Now, the next slide. Since I can't see them myself, I'm going through my hard copy. I'm hoping that we're all on the same slide, because now we're talking about Section G of the solicitation, and then of course later it goes into your contract. And this is where contract administration information is provided. And in this section, it specifies the accounting and appropriation data, where the government actually inserts the pot of money, the fund site, CITE, the fund site that's actually funding the contract. And also, this is where the government indicates to you, the contractor, the remittance requirements, tells you what you need to do if you want to get paid. Everything's done electronically now. The Air Force, and I believe the Army as well, uses what they call the wide area workflow system for invoicing and for payments. And this is where you're told, you're given information about who your contracting officer is, who your program manager is, and who the inspector or the quality assurance evaluator is going to be. All this information is going to be in this section here. And it gives you detailed instructions on how to go about setting up the electronic remittance to make sure that you invoice and you get paid properly and promptly. And sometimes during the course of a contract, there could be changes in personnel. So a modification to an awarded contract for Section G is what notifies you whether there's been a change in the contract administrator or maybe even the contract officer or program manager on your contract. This is where you would find that information in Section G. The next slide is Section H. This is where special contract requirements are addressed. And some contracts might have special requirements because of the nature of what's being purchased. Sometimes locally, a particular installation may have their own local clauses that is just for that location. This is where they would incorporate that into the contract, first into the solicitation, then into the awarded contract in Section H. In some cases where there's the need for prevailing wage determinations, for instance, that's a little bit outside of the wage determinations that are provided by the DOL. Special prevailing wages for specific trades, for instance, that are needed to perform on a particular project. This is where those prevailing wages would be incorporated into the contract, is in Section H. Okay, the next slide should show you a snapshot of Section I. This is where all the plethora of contract clauses are included. The clauses can be included in the contract by reference or in full text. But these clauses are required by law and regulation. They are mandatory clauses. They are selected by the contract specialist based on what the acquisition is, whether it's construction or services. Some of it's tied to the small business program. Other clauses are tied to the dollar thresholds, all of that. But they are required to be in the contract. These clauses dictate the terms and conditions of the contract performance. And they are also considered deliverables. One of the things that I noticed in working with a lot of construction contractors, they're looking at their solicitation. They pay a great deal of attention, obviously, to the statement of work or the drawings or the specifications. But too often, they forget about looking at the clauses in their contract. The clauses also dictate deliverables. They also dictate requirements and liabilities and responsibilities. So for any offer that is going after a government contract, don't forget those clauses. You have to look at the entire contract document. The four corners of the contract is what we say. Make sure that you're aware of those terms and conditions. The next section is Section J. Oh, one more thing about Section I, the clauses. One of the things that you want to do when you're going through the solicitation and prepare your proposal, some of those clauses are going to require fill-ins. There are blanks that you have to fill in information. Make sure that you do the fill-ins too, because if you don't, that could get you kicked out of the competition because you failed to follow all of the instructions, okay? So make sure that you do all the fill-ins for those clauses that require them. Okay, now on to Section J. Section J is the list of documents, exhibits, and attachments. Okay, and again, these are the documents that govern performance on the contract. They were too large to be incorporated directly into the solicitation at Section C, so instead they're listed by title, number of pages, and date by reference in Section J. And some of those documents, of course, would be like your statements of work for construction, performance work statements for service contracts, a statement of objectives, specifications, drawings, and of course the various technical and policy manuals, AFIs, ETLs, SOPs for the military, okay? Technical manuals that dictate how things are supposed to be performed, okay? All of those will be listed by title, the number of pages, and the date in Section J. And as you're going through your solicitation and you're putting your proposal together, one of the things that you want to do is you want to make sure that you have the latest up-to-date version of these documents. So it's provided directly to you, incorporated within the contract, or if they're simply listed in Section J, you want to make sure that you are referring to the most latest up-to-date versions as you're putting your proposal together, okay? Okay, the next slide is Section K. Again, we're talking about representations and certifications. Now, a lot of this is done electronically. Your registration in sam.gov serves to provide information back to the government, vital information about your company, your qualifications regarding your NAICS codes, your small business status, etc. And the government will be referring to that. But in the solicitation itself, there's also a Section K that may have clauses that are requiring fill-ins. You need to fill in information. And you want to make sure that what you fill in jives with what you have provided via your registration in sam.gov. Make sure that the information is all consistent, cross-references each other, and does not contradict, okay? And as we had mentioned before in a prior session, we had said that in sam.gov, you want to make sure that you update your registration online on an annual basis. And as your company does more and more work and you expand your resume, so to speak, your repertoire, you make sure that you update your registration to include those new NAICS codes. Now in Section K, this includes your status as a large or small business. This is where you indicate there's information about small business categories, size requirements, the NAICS codes, financial solvency. You'll see all of that in there, okay? And it's all addressed in Section K. Now, starting with Section K, L, and M, those sections fall off with the award of the contract. They're only included in the solicitation itself. But upon award of the contract itself goes from sections A through J. However, sections K, L, and M stays in the official contract file because they were part of the solicitation and they're considered to be source selection sensitive. So that is something that the contracting office still maintains as part of the official contract file. Now, the next slide is Section L. Section L and Section M are two of the most important sections of the solicitation for you, the offerer. Section L is where all of the information that's got to be included in your proposal is identified. And as I mentioned before, each section of the solicitation will have its own specific clauses. There will be clauses included in Section L that pertains to the proposal preparation. Okay. In Section L is where you're told how to format and organize your proposal. And your cost and pricing data, your proof of eligibility to show that you are eligible to propose. Like, for instance, it indicates how you would substantiate your small business certifications. And in those source selections that are more formal, this is where they give you the instructions on how to provide your past performance information. There may be documents in it that you're going to fill out where you'll actually put in the information regarding your past performance. It tells you how recent and how relevant that past performance must be in order to meet the criteria for evaluation. And also, this is where they'll tell you if a past performance questionnaire needs to be mailed out, sent out, to a reference. You pick the references, the questionnaire gets sent to that reference, and that reference, whoever they may be, a former contracting officer or whomever, they will fill that paperwork out and send it back directly to the contracting evaluation team. It does not go back to you, okay? But all of that information is included in Section L. It tells you when and how you're going to submit your proposal. There's information regarding any site visits or pre-proposal conferences. All of that vital information is included in Section L, and you need to read it very carefully. You need to follow the instructions very carefully. Okay, and then the last slide that I have here for the various sections of the RFP is Section M. Now, Section M is vital to you also as an offerer. Section M is where the evaluation factors for award are presented. Now, it identifies the significant factors and sub-factors that the government's going to consider when they're evaluating your proposals. And it also goes into a great deal of detail on how the actual evaluation process it takes place and what the basis for award will be. Now, when you look in Section M, the scoring system, whether it's a color coding or number rating system, all of that is outlined in Section M. It talks about the various criteria that the government's using to evaluate the proposals. And it also talks about, in great descriptive language, what it takes to meet each of those levels of compliance. So when you're putting your proposal together, here's a tip for when you're putting your proposal together and you want to know what does it take to meet the highest levels in the rating system for evaluation of your proposal. You take a look at what the criteria is and what you have to include. And then you make sure that your proposal has information that meets those levels of criteria. All that information is in there, okay? Now, sometimes if there's a great deal of information for the very high dollar, very, very convoluted and drawn out evaluations for large dollar source selections, Section L and Section M may actually have additional information that's included as attachments to the solicitation. That's where all of that really excruciating, detailed information will be included. So when you're going through your proposal, your solicitation, you're looking at the solicitation, you look at section L and M, but then also look to see if there is additional detailed information for section L and M attached to the solicitation. And you want to make sure that you really keep all that in mind as you're putting your proposal together. One of the great things about the federal government is not only do they tell you how they're going to evaluate your proposal, how to put your proposal together, what to include in your proposal, they tell you how to win too. If you're really paying attention, they tell you how do you meet these various levels of compliance within your proposal. All of that's addressed for you. Everything is transparent, everything is provided in great detail, and everything is provided to all offerers equally so that nobody has any advantage over another. Okay, and then the last few slides that I had included in this presentation are items that I believe are of, they should be special emphasis for offerers to keep in mind. I believe another session that we're going to be doing is a workshop for the MBDA and the Arizona Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, is where we go into greater detail on how you put together your proposals. But in general, right now, what I want to cover is for each section of the solicitation, just some things to keep in mind, okay? So for instance, in the next slide, special emphasis for offerers, section A. You want to make sure that you make those bid or proposal due dates, okay? And you want to make sure for construction that you meet the required bid guarantee dates. That's all tied to availability of funding, okay? As you know, the government cannot award a contract unless funding is available. You'll see that language in the solicitation. That award of the contract is pending availability of funding. We have what we call the Anti-Deficiency Act. Contracting officer cannot award without sufficient funds. No money, no award of a contract. And sometimes when we're asking you to provide a proposal, we'll ask you to make sure that your bid is guaranteed for 60 days or 90 days, because that's when we're waiting for funding to come in. It may take 60 days, 90 days, maybe even 180 days when we're going at the end of the fiscal year and the government is waiting for fallout funds to come. So to ensure that that the bid is still good up until that date, when funding arrives, they will ask you to meet the requirements of their bid guarantee dates, okay? And again, for construction, there's going to be performance and payment bond requirements. And make sure that you sign your proposal. In some of our evaluations that we've done in source selections in the past, every once in a while we'll get a proposal in where the offerer had forgotten to sign their proposal. So make sure that you do that. It's just little things like that that sometimes could slip through the cracks and might get you kicked out of a competition, okay? Section B, supplies and services and prices. Make sure that you insert those line item pricing, okay? And if there's going to be option years that are included in that particular acquisition, make sure that you put in your pricing for the option years and that you address if there's any escalation rates, because the government looks closely at inflation rates, making sure that there's no front loading, things like that. Material imbalance of the proposed pricing, okay? And then the next slide. Again, special emphasis for offerers, section F for deliveries and performance. We want to make sure that you comply with the delivery requirements, but if you can deliver faster and sooner, include that in your proposal. The government's always happy to get things faster and sooner if they can get even more for their dollar, okay? And again, especially for construction contracts, the period of performance might be negotiable. Okay, it doesn't hurt to ask. Section G, Contract administration information. Again, if you want to get paid, please follow the instructions. And you're going to be doing your electronic payments via wide area workflow. Okay. And pay attention to who your contracting officer and administrator is. Post the word you want to develop a good rapport, a good relationship with the contracting officer and the contracting specialist who is administering your contract. In the next slide, again, special emphasis for offers in Section H. Pay attention to the tailored local clauses because some of those local clauses may change some of the requirements of just as an example. When it comes to access to an installation, for instance, Luke Air Force Base, there's going to be mandatory clauses regarding access to the installation, but there may be a special tailored clause in Section H that specifically addresses how you, the offerer, and how your employees will access the flight line, for instance, if there's special requirements for training, for driving and things like that around the flight lines. So you take a look at those special local clauses because you've got to meet the requirements of those too. If there's special badging or license or certifications that are required in order to perform your contract. Section I, again, pay attention to the clauses for the terms and conditions of your contract and how you're supposed to perform. And especially pay attention to the tailored clauses and those that require fill-ins. And the next slide, special emphasis for offerers, your Section J. Make sure, one more time, that you have complete up-to-date set of documents. Check the dates on the documents, okay? And you make sure that what's provided to you is what's referenced in the statement of work or the performance work statement, because the statement of work or the performance work statement for service contracts references back to certain documents for reference. Make sure that everything is consistent and is up to date for you, because it could impact your performance. Section K, one more time, representations and certifications. Make sure that you do the clause fill-ins and make sure that it cross-references accurately back to your SAM.gov registration. And the next slide, special emphasis for offerers one more time, Section L. And basically what we do is we tell everybody, read it, do it, eat a banana, okay? The government goes into excruciating detail of everything they want in your proposal. So please follow those instructions so that your proposal is not eliminated for something very innocuous, small, something that could have easily been prevented. And Section M, again, comply with the criteria. Take a look at those evaluation factors that the government's going to be using. The government is required to provide that information to you, the offerer, and the government is required to follow their own instructions. Sometimes post-award, some protests come in against the award because the government failed to follow their own instructions. So you pay attention, okay? Sometimes you have to educate the government a little bit, okay? But anyway, that is the last slide. Hopefully I haven't gone over the time frame too much. And if there are any questions, if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to answer them. If there isn't time, then I'll be happy to provide the answers. The MBDA team, they can provide those answers back to you if need be, okay?
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Were there any questions for me?
It doesn't look like we have any questions right now in the chat box, but if anybody has any questions and wants to go ahead and use these last couple of minutes to submit your questions in the chat, we can totally go through that for a little bit. Thank you so much for all your information. It was super helpful, super detailed, and we really appreciate it. We'll be also, just so everyone knows, we'll be sharing Sam's contact info as well. So if you guys would like to connect and have any questions after the presentation or would even like to rewatch it, we'll go ahead and have that up in our post event email for today. But yeah, it doesn't look like we have any questions right now. So
Okay.
yeah, again, thank you so much, Sam. I think we're going to go ahead and transition to our member orientation. And we'll
Okay,
go
thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye-bye now.
Thanks.
Thank you.